These are the issues that we need to address. You understand what I say? You see? Set the path for the youth them. Share, like, and subscribe and stay tuned to the channel. I don't know all this. Yes, I. Greetings to the mighty name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie once again. You see it? I'm going to continue with the reading from the book Born for Death. Seeing? With the chapter 3 now, Blood and Fire. You see it? Now, more I don't know, say, see the book here? The book here has been banned from Jamaica, from the Jamaican market. Seeing? You can get it for buy on Amazon. Seeing, you can get the what's it called, the online version as well. It might be a bit cheaper. You see it. And you see, the book here now, it just shows you where we are come from to where we are reached. It's evidence that things hasn't changed much from 40, 50 years ago somewhat. In terms of the way our perception towards politics, leadership, our expectations, and and what we have gotten out of politics so far as a people. You understand what I say? So it's just another angle for educate the youth, them, give them some awareness of where them are dealing with them there, and where them might get an indication as to where to channel some energy in order to see some positive results. You understand what I say? Yeah. In regards to this channel here now, this channel here not come to glorify or glamorize any form of violence against the woman, picnic, people, human being, or anything whatsoever. Nobody whatsoever. You see the argument behind any prison story, them have to make the youth them aware of the graphic part of prison. You see. So if some man have some glamorous part or glamorous experience, him just start a channel and share that. See, it's very shameful when you're commenting on them type of thing there and make it look like you want to promote or support some level of acceptance towards the condition in a prison. You see, especially GP prison Jamaica. See, that's disgraceful. Stay somewhere else, go, like Mr. Go start a channel and promote them type of thing. See, anyway, enough respect to all the subscribers them. See, all new subscriber, big up yourself. And if you watch the channel and you like what you see, just subscribe and keep the thing growing, you know. We could got 10,000. You see. Yeah. So we are reach chapter 3, you know. The blood. Blood for blood, fire for fire. Yeah, I remember a speech like that, you know, an argument like that. Let's continue, yeah. The guns that traumatized uptowners were so commonplace in central Kingston that Bramble's children vied with each other to identify them. They lay awake in the night and listened to the different sounds made by single-shot revolvers and rapid-fire automatics. The revolvers were antiques by then, high-powered weapons being the norm since the 1980 election campaign. For almost 50 years, the people of downtown Kingston have lived with intensifying violence, institutionalized warfare with the police, political banditry, and the quieter brutality of being bulldozed or torched out of their tenements so that one politician or another could build a housing project for his supporters. This has been going on in one wave after another since Jamaica went into the first birth pangs of nationhood in 1938. There have always been two Jamaicas, the peaceful island nostalgically remembered by the few, and the one experienced by the rest as the daily burning that Bramble's friend Chronicles knew. He was in his early 70s, old enough to remember the late 1930s and early 1940s when Norman Manley and his first cousin Alexander Bustamante founded two parties that led Jamaica into independence. Late at night, when Chronicles came home to Foster Lane from his daily round of scourging up a little money from his friends on the dock, we would sit on Bramble's veranda and reason about history by the light of a kerosene lantern. In many ways, he said the politicians and their gunmen took over where the slave masters and their overseers left off. The practice of intimidation was a logical outgrowth of the brutal intimacy that had always prevailed between the powerful and the powerless. The gang business did not come from nothing, Chronicles said, and you must understand that this violent passed through many stages. When I was a young man coming up, we used to throw bricks and bottles to break up the other parties' meetings. I remember when Norman Manley told us to bring brooms to PNP rallies because everyone had one in their yard, even the poorest. So we would carry our brooms to all the meetings and chant, sweep them out against the JLP. The broom became the PNP symbol. Chronicles smiled at the innocence of these days. Everything started to change up when the first gun started coming in the 60s. And then things only got worse. Yet the violence was always there. The PNP and the GLP playing divide and conquer with us sufferers. You may be surprised by how much politics mean to us in the ghetto, but the reason is because we know that if our party loses, we will starve. Jamaica's two parties were born in the refining fire of a labor rebellion that started in the late spring of 1938. The First World War had raised the price of sugar, bringing a brief moment of higher expectation to the island's workforce. But then the worldwide depression came, and these hopes were crushed in the post-war crash. The sugar industry was monopolized by one British company, Tate and Lyle, which poured capital for labor-saving new machinery into several big estates and began laying off workers. Those lucky to still be employed were earning a shilling a day. One of the plantations was Frome, in the parish of Westmoreland near Negril, and it was there that workers first rose up, set the cane field on fire, and went on strike for a living wage. Conditions were just as bad on the United Fruit Company wharf in Kingston. Lord Olivier, one of the island's colonial governors, used to go down to the pier where the workers died from malnutrition, tuberculosis, and yaws. He watched them staggering under their loads of bananas, expressionless, all but for a kind of unquestioning patience of beast of burden, the look of all yoked animal in their eyes. But in the spring of 1938, the beast of burden proved they were humans. When the Frome sugar workers set fire to the fields, Kingston dock workers joined the uprising. Soon the wharves were paralyzed by a strike that spread quickly to the ranks of all of the city's workers. Firemen, garbage collectors, tram conductors, and the night soilmen who hauled excrement, that's shit, them used to do that at Jamaica too, who hauled excrement away from the city's yards before dawn. That means they used to have a shit bucket thing with them going with white, English people, colonial people. Kingston, that one that drive me back, Rasta, much bit space there, man. Sure. Kingston erupted into mass demonstration and torchlit rallies. The city's small middle class, teachers, baristas, civil servants, and businessmen had been watching for many years as social conditions got worse. And they were edging towards action. Their leading voice was Norman Manley, the soft-spoken, Oxford-educated barrister who went out to the cane field at Frome and promised the strikers he would help them get their living wage. But while Manley and his supporters sympathized with the downtrodden black label where Jamaicans call Kwashi, the African name that stands for the very black and poor. Educated reformers were not yet ready to cross the line of caste and color and join Kwashi's rank. So far, the strikes were a black people's struggle. Boom. And the colored elite and the colored knew it. So far, the strike was a black people's struggle, and the colored knew it. So they watched and they waited. But the working men and women were not waiting for them. For 15 years, they had been listening to Marcus Garvey and his Jamaican disciples preach the doctrine of black self-determination. Now they found a temporary leader from the ranks of Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. The Harlem-based UNIA has UNIA. His name was St. William Grant, and he was a militant who wanted nothing less for his country than full independence from England. For a brief moment, it looked as if the working class rebellion might just transform itself into an anti-colonial movement. But Grant had a rival for Kwashi's loyalty, a fiery, near-white demagogue named Alexander Bustamante. Buster is as everyone called him, soon eclipsed Grant into the sight of the masses, and his rise to power changed Jamaica forever. Bustamante had only recently returned to his native Jamaica from a long pilgrimage through the Caribbean. He had cut cane in Cuba and worked on the Panama Canal. His origins were shrouded in mystery, and he liked it that way. His real name was Clark, but he chose Bustamante for its Latin flair, and he promoted his own legend as a self-designated defender of the poor. He was a getter moneylender at the time the 1938 uprising began, so he already cracked a whip over the sufferer's head. With his light skin, wavy hair, and strong-featured face punctuated by enormous bushy eyebrow, Bustamante was a riveting presence. He was a ladies' man, a distinct reputation-raising advantage in the lusty world of Jamaica's politics, and a ferocious speaker who held crowds spellbound with a combination of angry rhetorics like kill the Rasta or kill all Rasta, and bad grammar. Bread, he would roar. The people want bread, and then he would spell it out. B-R-E-D. Bread, boy. Buster's color gave him a definite advantage in a colony where blackness was no virtue. To this day, Jamaicans sometimes refer to themselves as Afro-Saxon, admiring that they are still bedeviled by their reverence for English skin and English ways. Even though Bustamante loved to fulminate against the local elite, he always proclaimed his adoration for the British monarchy, a Jamaican paradox that has prevailed ever since slaves rose up against their masters and turned for salvation to the crown. Within weeks of the onset of the Kingston General Strike, Bustamante had ousted Sir William Grant from the leadership of the labor movement and had taken charge of the city's docks. "My people," he shouted at rallies, "you don't have to think. I will think for you." Why may I tell you, John? "The chief," they roared back. "We will follow Bustamante till we die." When I asked chronicles about those times, he was still bitter over the chief demagogue triumph. "I always believed that Grant owed Buster money," he said, "and that was why he lost out. But I will tell you this. Buster was one of the greatest tragedies in Jamaican history. If Grant had been the man to lead us, maybe this country would have had a real black-oriented government. Instead, what we got was white non-rule, and we black people never learned to think for ourselves. Bustamante's main strategy in the beginning was to keep Jamaica in a state of unrest. He played on race and the threat of violence, the trump card in the sufferer's deck. There will be bloodshed, he warned. I expect everyone in this country to follow. The niggers in this country shall rise. This will be war. We want revolution in this country. And before whites destroy us, we will destroy them. The Negro blood has been shedding for the past 102 years, and the time has come when we shall shed theirs. The British locked him up. With Kingston in turmoil, the colonial office in London was looking for someone a little less incendiary to intervene with the strikers. Someone who belonged, someone who belonged to the elite, but to whom Kwashi might still listen. Such a man will be reviled and hated by one class, wrote William Mackin, a progressive newspaper editor. He will quite possibly be betrayed by the others. Norman Manley was that man. He and Alexander Bustamante happened to be first cousins, but their affinity ended there. Manley was a Rhodes Scholar whose Oxford studies were cut short by World War I. He joined the British Army and was decorated for heroism, and it was in the trenches that he got his first taste of racism. As a brown Jamaican among white Englishmen, he married Edna Swithenbank, the English-born daughter of a Methodist missionary and his Jamaican wife, and brought her home to Jamaica after the war. He began practicing law, and by 1938 he was both a King's Counsel and a keeper of the island's social conscience, the founder of a group called Jamaica Welfare, which politely lobbied the colonial office for reform. Manley launched the People's National Party in the fall of 1938, 6 months after the Labour Rebellion, with a moderate platform of Fabian socialism and a call for gradual decolonization. The colonial office had no particular objection to Manley, especially after his peacemaking efforts during the strikes, but it wanted Jamaica to have a two-party Westminster system in place before the island would be ready for its first election under full adult suffrage in 1944. Independence would not come for another 18 years. It was clear that once the British let him out of jail, Alexander Bustamante would found a second party to harass Manley's PNP. He started the Jamaica Labour Party as soon as he came out of prison in 1942, and from then on became acutely conscious of his new political profile. The chief quieted down considerably and began acting in a more statesman-like fashion, trumpeting his loyalty to king and country. In 1944, with the war coming to an end and Britain ready at last to unload her fractious Caribbean colonies, Bustamante and JLP contested the first election and trounced Manley. The PNP won only 4 seats in the House of Assembly, and Manley lost in his own constituency. He and Bustamante alternated as premiers until independence came, but Bustamante was the one in power when it did. It was the chief who waltzed with Princess Margaret on the night of August 6, 1962, when the Union Jack was lowered for the last time in the National Stadium, and Jamaica's black, gold, and green flag was hoisted above the euphoric crowd. But the reformation of Jamaica's two parties was not the only power struggle that dominated the years leading up to independence. The other more violent fight went on between the two labor unions founded by Bustamante and Manley and aligned with their parties. The JLP had its own union, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, BITU, while the PNP had its trade union Congress, TUC. These unions battled to represent sectors of the newly mobilized workforce. Thus, politics and unionism locked in a deadly fusion that turned Jamaica's working people into two armed camps. The BITU and the TUC went into cane fields, bauxite plants, and shipping facilities to fight for supremacy, and violence became the norm in unionism and politics alike. Before the boss would even sit down at the bargaining table, Chronicles said the unions had to bring in thugs to demonstrate their power, and this was where a lot of the first gang violence began. The BITU controlled the docks. It does to this day, and the TUC fought back again elsewhere. In sugar, bauxite, the building trades, the city workers, those were hard fights, and the strong armed men carried the day. Chronicles had known one of the founders of the PNP, William Isaac, who had also organized its union. Isaac never shrank from a fight, and when someone asked him in 1944 whether he regretted Jamaica's descent into partisan violence, Isaac shot back, "What are a few broken skulls in the growth of a nation?" Central Kingston was then part of Isaac's constituency, and he became the first PNP politician to play gang hardball with the JLP. He founded his own garrison of street fighters, Group 69, and led it into the fray when Busta's men broke up PNP rallies with stones and beer bottles. Busta played rough right from the start, Chronicles said, and he really saw himself as some kind of king. I remember going down to a meeting one night at the Myrtle Bank to hear him speak, with Norman Manley on the podium behind him, and Busta looked out over the crowd and said, "You see, my cousin, it is the two of us, him or me, and if it is not me, it is him who will rule you. We are a royal family." The two of them locked Jamaica down tight. The JLP took Winston Churchill V for a victory signal, the two fingers raised as their sign. Later on in the Black Power time, the PNP started using the clenched fist. You know what we say those two signs really mean. He held up his two fingers and then closed them into a fist. We too hold them tight. It's the same leaders with two different faces. One was white and the other was brown, but it didn't make much difference. As the two parties evolved in the years leading up to independence, their constituencies divided along lines of race and class. The PNP became the party of educated, brown-skinned professionals, and its outlook was cosmopolitan and internationalism. After Manley became premier in 1955, he devoted much of his energy to forming a West Indian Federation of British colonies, knowing that unity would be their best hope for economic development after independence. But Bustamante opposed the Federation, as did many Jamaicans, full of a large island sense of superiority that made them reluctant to band together with little islands like Antigua, St. Lucia, or St. Kitts. The Federation's defeat in 1961 referendum was a crushing blow for Manley. Bustamante became Prime Minister 6 months later, ushering Jamaica into the independence whose groundwork Norman Manley had laid. Meanwhile, the JLP was turning into a kind of schizophrenic entity. The part of the black have-nots and the reactionary haves, an odd alliance that still persists. Bustamante set the tone with his claim to speak and think for the people while usaging the class fear of the rich. Irish writer Patrick Leigh Fermor, while visiting Kingston in 1950, met with Bustamante and Manley and described the JLP leader as a pistol-packing, hard-living, humorous, ex-rabble-raising demagogue whose every word and gesture have an engaging histrionic phoniness. As Jamaica inch, that just give credit to the facts and when him bust him shirt in front of the soldier and say, shoot me and left my people. That was the height of phoneism or phoniness. That's the histrionic thing that he's talking about here. Anyway, as Jamaica inched towards nationhood, world events began to impinge on its internal affairs. The Cuban Revolution sent shockwaves through the Caribbean, beckoning other islands to confront their own entrenched elites. The civil rights movement in the United States sent the message of racial equality around the world and struck with a gale force on an island whose black majority hearkened not only to the non-violent words of Martin Luther King Jr., but also to the angrier voices of leaders like Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton, and Eldridge Cleaver. The ruling JLP banned black power literature, but it couldn't jam the airwaves that poured American soul music and rhythms and blues into Kingston's ghetto street corners, along with the news of the changes that were coming in the United States. And like this, and you see it, the same party we are jump and a chump and a promoter. So I'm enough careful of them boy we are jump and a talk about them is for you, because them is not for you when it comes down to the nitty-gritty. The basic things that promote you, develop and benefit you, they don't support it. You understand? Them we always jump and talk and say pretty words and rate. When the time come, them start talking a different grade of English where you can understand a different level of English than where them different terminology and where them use in the campaign. When them a campaign, them speak in a proper local term where you can understand. You know, see it, but when budget time come and understand nothing where them boy say. You see it. Changes that were coming in the United States. And like the street corners in American ghetto, the ones in Kingston were mirroring the country's social dislocation and already spawning little gangs of their own. Most of their members wielded only ratchet knives, but a few had started to carry guns. Although these gangs had not yet been drawn into the political web, they were already angry rebels spoiling for a fight. Johnny Two Bads, who worshipped the gunfighters in Hollywood westerns, they were the perfect street warriors, waiting in the wings for the politicians to recognize their usefulness. The island economy of the 1960s was an added source of both hope and disillusion. Bauxite and tourism were booming, but their new success didn't mean a dent in the lives of most Jamaicans. The bauxite plants belonged to big multinationals like Kaiser, Revere, and Reynolds Metals. And even though they paid the highest wage on the island, this in itself created a labor aristocracy that only made subsistent farmers and the peons and sugar estate all the more aware of their poverty. Tourism was even more socially corrosive. It brought seasonal, low-paying jobs to a few people who lived in the small towns on the North Coast. And this work came with a wicked, atavistic fantasy. The Jamaica Tourist Board wanted white visitors to see the island as the old South of Gone with the Wind. you can rent a lovely life in Jamaica. Code one tourist board advertisement. Rent a villa, rent a cook, rent a maid, rent a nanny, rent a gardeners. It started with a country house or a hilltop hideaway that comes equipped with gentle people named Ivy or Maud or Malcolm who will cook, tend, mend, diaper, and launder for you. Who will Mr. Peter please? Who will Mr. Peter please? You all day long pamper you with homemade coconut pie. I might admire you when you look soft, handsome, giggle at your jokes and weep when you leave. Ivy, Maud, and Malcolm were living in dirt floor shacks where children were with rickets sat dull-eyed in the yards. They walked miles to work in hotel kitchens and scrape and eating food into the garbage. Then they walked home along scalding roads while the tourists sped by in shiny cars. So if Ivy, Maud, and Malcolm wept, it wasn't because you were leaving. None of the prosperity from Bauxite and tourism trickled down into Kingston. The city was swelling every day with migrants from the rural parishes who were running from the countryside to a city where they envisioned plenty of work, decent housing, running water, and transportation. What they found were the dungers, garbage dumps, and empty lands that had turned into shanty towns blooming on the waterfront of Western Kingston. Me did think town would have been pretty, said Joycey, a sweet-tempered, withered prostitute who was one of Bramble's oldest friends. She had come to Kingston in 1960, a young country girl with stars in her eyes. But I got off the train there in the west by Coronation Market and the depot, and all I could see was pitchy-patchy shanty and zinc fence, maga dog and hungry belly picnic. Not a true house inside. Lord, I wanted to go right back home. But I was proud in them days, and I thought I could make something out of myself in Kingston, you know? Once you go a town, it's like you go a foreign. You can't come back unless your pocket full. That's because when you come a town on the right, send back. Be a lie, you go tell the people them down there. So now if you go back with no pocket full of money, you know, see it, and not tell them the truth, I walk on and tell them to better them stay and farm up country or something like that. Anyway, I could continue. The shanty towns that sprawl there, but no, same like Britain. The people them, you're like, when me just come here, it's a Brixton, when you go in a Brixton, it's like a Jamaica, like a little, some places like a little down a Coronation Street, you see. You know, see, it's like a Coronation Street there, in a market, something like, Coronation Market downtown, you know, see. Yeah, some place, if you take out your video camera and walk around in a circle, man, the people can't tell, say, Britain there. But Jamaican people don't take picture of them place, eh? No, them got, they like the neighboring town named Croydon, where be white people there and the shop them look more up to top tier and rated, and that's why them go take picture and make it look like, say, firing this and rated, posing in them best clothes. I don't know if Jamaican do it, but I know the African them going to IKEA. IKEA set out the bedroom them like they set out a little room, a little area like a bedroom, set out a little area like a living room with the latest furniture them in the bathroom and everything set up like it's a whole house, you know. Just like a showpiece. Yeah? But most of the African them go in there, go pose and take picture and send it back to foreign like I feed them house that some of your house look, they like it and all them nastiness there. You know see? Anyway, make we continue with the shanty town. The shanty towns had spawned their own culture of African redemption by then. Rastafarianism and the Locksmen were living in the West Kingston jungle. The lion-maned barefoot prophets took their philosophy from Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism and their inspiration from Ethiopia's Haile Selassie. It's not Marcus Garvey. Everybody keep misconstruing this thing and say them take it from Marcus Garvey. You can credit Marcus Garvey with Pan-Africanism if you want, but African orientated mentality is Rasta to complete, and the inception of Rasta start with Leonard Howell. Him and Marcus Garvey used to para Marcus Garvey, born out the king, Haile Selassie, the emperor, and Leonard Howell fall out with him for that, because Marcus Garvey see himself in a position where him himself wanted to be the king. I think him was gonna be the king, but you know, the anointed was already there, and him made some disrespectful, disparaging comments and things like that. Which could be one of the main reasons why Leonard Howell walk away from him and go to Jamaica to start him own thing, farm up and big up and build up and develop him own thing. You know, see? Seeing some, I credit him with the Rastafarianism. I could leave it upon Africanism, respectfully. You know, see, Rastafari come from Emperor Haile Selassie the first. With this very said brother I never to show much respect for. You know, see? Anyway, the inspiration and their inspiration from Ethiopia's Haile Selassie. When Rastafarianism was born in the late 1930s, Ethiopia was the only African nation unfettered by colonialism, and Rastafarians believed that Selassie was the living incarnation of Negos, the black man's true God. Rasta is God without any apology. Brambles love to say, quoting one of the Brethren's prayer, they challenged every one of Jamaica's cherished social norms, churchical Christianity, hair straightened Afro-Saxon primness, and the politics that flourished in its intractable corrupt Babylonian shitstem. So there was war between the Rasta and society in those early days. When the locksmen ventured out of the jungle, they were hounded through the streets and beaten by the police, who took special pleasure in shearing off their locks, their dreads. Most of the brethren were apolitical in the extreme and wanted nothing to do with Babylon. But black American militants saw this Jamaican brotherhood as a potential revolutionary vanguard. In 1960, this ephemeral alliance sparked a brief uprising, one of the stranger episodes in the island's long history of revolts. It began when Claudius Henry, another Jamaican-born visionary in the tradition of Alexander Bedouin, returned to his homeland from the United States. Henry brought with him a small cadre of black American radicals from a group called the First African Corps, based in the Bronx. Soon, this vanguard was joined by militant Rastafarians who hearkened to Henry's preachments that he was the repairer of the breach between Africa and the Caribbean. The Rastas believed that he would shepherd them back to Africa. But meanwhile, Henry was stockpiling guns, brought with the proceeds from several bank robberies committed in New York City by a rogue police officer who belonged to the First Africa Corps. In June 1960, the West Indian Regiment raided Henry's guerrilla camp in the hills above Kingston. Five of his men shot their way out of the ambush and through several police roadblocks, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 3 others. Among the guns and the revolutionary literature discovered in the raid was a letter from Claudius Henry to Fidel Castro. Dear Dr. Castro, Henry wrote, we wish to draw your attention to the conditions which confront us today as a poor, underprivileged people, which were brought here from Africa by the British slave traders over 400 years ago. We now desire to return home in peace, to live under our own vine and fig tree, otherwise a government like yours that gives justice to the poor. All our efforts to have a peaceful repatriation have proven a total failure. Hence, we must fight a war for what it ours be by right. A war for what is ours by right. Therefore, we want to assure you, sir, and your government that Jamaica and the rest of the British West Indies will be turned over to you after this war, which we are preparing to start for Africa's freedom is completed. And we, her scattered children, are restored. We are getting ready for an invasion on the Jamaican government. Therefore, we need your help. We have the necessary men for the job. The black people of Jamaica are with you and your government 100% and desire to see that Jamaica gets into your hands before we leave for Africa. So like that man had buy some sheep. I never gone him really buy. It took another week after the raid for the police to hunt down the militants who had escaped. Their leader, Henry's son, Reynald, was hanged for treason a year later. Norman Manley, Queen's Counsel, was one of the barristers who prosecuted the case. And this argument against the Rastafarians who followed Claudius Henry did not endear him to the brethren. But Henry himself became a passionate partisan of the PNP. He served 8 years in prison and came out in 1969, still a believer in the inevitability of African repatriation. In the 1972 election, he threw his weight behind the young Michael Manley, believing that the son of a famous father had seen the light and would soon send Jamaica's black captives home to Africa to be free. Despite its magical realist undertones, Claudius Henry aborted rebellions was a very real distress signal, a warning to Jamaica of how deep the fissures of race and class were. David DeCosta, a white Jamaican journalist who began working for the Gleaner, told the BBC in the 1960s, saw the Henry affair as a harbinger of what was to come. Our established society has always been very fragile, he said. Problems are unsolvable, and you will never really be able to meet your own aspirations. The more decent a society you postulate, the more impossible reaching your own goals become. Given the expectations that you yourself engender. What I saw happening in the 60s was the established society beginning to break its own bonds. It couldn't meet its own aspirations, and therefore it became hypocritical in its own eyes. The judges, the lawyers, the teachers all taught a standard which they knew would not be met. India all taught a standard which they knew could not be met. In their hearts of hearts, they knew the situation was racing beyond them. Like many other uptown Kingstonians, after the Henry Rebellion, DaCosta started carrying a gun. Coming home late and slightly drunk one night to his home on Stony Hill, he almost shot someone he thought was a prowler lurking in the bushes, but it was only the gardener boy, too shy to come forward and ask DaCosta for his spade. The next day, I took the gun to the Constant Spring police station and turned it in. I said, here, you keep it. I never want to see it again. The detective on duty asked me what had happened, and when I told him, he laughed. But you would have had every right to kill the boy, he said, and we would have looked after you. And that was really my first glimmering of what color meant in Jamaica. I could have killed an innocent child and been looked after for it by the police. I never carried a gun after that. But while DaCosta was turning away from weapons, the rest of his countrymen began using them with deadly frequency. Gun violence was already a fact of life in the ghettos. where the two political parties had embarked on their struggle for supremacy. The sufferers were soon to be introduced to a young politician who would take this internecine violence to a new level. He was the son of a Syrian-Lebanese family from Kingston, but he was born in Boston and educated at Harvard. In 1954, he came home to Jamaica to carve out a place for himself. His name was Edward Seaga. Seaga had a bachelor's degree in sociology. He had a keen interest in Afro-Jamaican revivalism, cults, and their music. He quickly made friends with shepherds at the Revivalist Tabernacle and wrote a pamphlet about their religion. And he also opened a little recording studio in West Kingston where he started producing mento, ska, and some early reggae music. Seaga's ties to the Pocominian church led by Kappa Reynolds let Seaga tap into one of the deepest veins in Jamaica's religious life. Despite Seaga's white skin, his alliance with Kappa sent a crucial message through West Kingston. This foreign-born white fella had serious credential as a rootsman, and he was nobody's fool. Legend has it that Seaga wanted at first to join the PNP and that Norman Manley turned him away because he disliked the young man. But Alexander Bustamante recognized Seaga's political skills and received him into the JLP, appointing him to Legislative Council in 1959. Seaga won the West Kingston seat in Parliament 3 years later. He has never lost it since. The JLP then named him Minister of Welfare and Development, a position he soon began abusing so savagely that the sufferers called him the Minister of Warfare and Devilment. Seaga saw that the surest route to power lay in building housing for his supporters. And in 1966, he embarked on a particularly brutal siege of some clearance in the West Kingston shantytown called Bakawal. The neighborhood was packed with PNP supporters and Rastafari squatters living in tiny shacks built out of flattened gasoline cans, hammered cheese tins, and salvaged lumber. It had not been easy to build, but the people of Bakawal had managed to make a community of their own. Seaga routed them with bulldozers and squadrons of police. The destruction of Bakawal was something that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. Some of the Rastas tried to fight back, and a few lay down in front of the advancing machineries, but they were no match for the police with their rifles and tear gas. When the shanties were leveled and the bulldozers had scraped them into piles, work began on a housing project called Tivoli Gardens, where Seaga rewarded his supporters with homes. They became his people for life. The PNP did not stand idly by while Seaga became the patron saint of West Kingston. A young politician named Dudley Thompson ran against Seaga and lost, but in the process began to carve out a power base of his own in Western Kingston. He was a short man with poachy features, and he wore a knitted tam to signify his solidarity with the sufferer. People called him Cuddly Dudley behind his back, but he took himself very seriously. A British-trained barrister like his friend Norman Manley, Thompson went to Kenya with the legal team that defended Jomo Kenyatta against charges of sedition. And after that, he started calling himself the Burning Spear, like the African freedom fighter. Thompson and Seaga fought a proxy war in the streets of West Kingston, mustering small armies from the ranks of the neighborhood's top gunmen. These gangs were the ancestors of every political posse that came later. Seaga's main squadron was the Phoenix, whose leader were Zaki, the high priest, and Frank Badwood Gillespie. One of the Phoenix members was a charismatic youth called Claude Massop, who was already apprenticing himself to these masters and rising through the ranks. He would become the undisputed Don of Tivoli Gardens in the 1970s. The Phoenix had allies in other parts of the cities where the JLP was trying to capture support. In Central Kingston, the Phoenix was aligned with a gang called the Max, based in the little corner called Southside. The Max threw its force behind the JLP, and Southside gradually became a labor rights stronghold within PNP-dominated Central Kingston. This divide and conquer strategy soon became the party's standard operating procedure throughout the city. Faced with the certain prospect of escalating gang warfare, the PNP started creating its own mercenary squadron. In Central Kingston, a gang called Tel Aviv began fighting off the Max from Southside. Its leader, Dixie Dawkins, told me they had picked the Israeli name after the movie Exodus came out because Tel Aviv was known to be impregnable. Over in Western Kingston, Dudley Thompson began assembling a fighting force of his own. The two gangs called the Vikings and Spanglers. The Vikings had taken their name from the movie starring Kirk Douglas, and one of their leaders, Glenn Pusey, started calling himself Dillinger after his favorite American outlaw. Thus began the time-honored tradition of gunmen modeling themselves on Hollywood desperados. The outlaws vied with each other for the distinction of killing top-ranking from opposing gangs. Dillinger claimed the honor of being the man who shot Zaki, the high priest, the JLP gunfighter from Tivoli. When the dust had cleared and Zaki was buried, the grieving Tivolis named a street after their fallen hero. The Spanglers, the other PNP posse, were based on Regent Street in West Kingston, and their leader was a robber named Big Uzi. The gun was already becoming famous in Jamaica, following its use in Israel. Soon the Spanglers and the Phoenix were gunning for each other. In retaliation for the murder of their leader, Zaki the high priest, Phoenix gunmen invaded a dance in Southside and killed a Spangler named Rashi, who was said to be Dudley Thompson's protege. When the case came to trial, Thompson pressed unsuccessfully for Rashi's killers to get the death penalty. The JLP Phoenix said the PNP Vikings got their chance to fight a full-scale street war in the spring of 1966, at the same time that Seaga was bulldozing the squatters out of Bakawal. A series of bitter industrial disputes broke out that April across the island, from the cane fields at Frome, where the 1938 labor uprising began, to the Kingston waterfront and the tourist hotel around Montego Bay. The strikes were sparked by a power struggle between the unions, but the violence soon spread to the West Kingston Street as displaced sufferers from Bakawal saw their chance to vent some of their rage. The Phoenix and the Viking rampage against police up and down the waterfront, along the Spanish Town Road, and through the narrow streets of Western Kingston. The gang had pistols, dynamite, and homemade bombs, but the security forces had a rifle and tear gas. The army sent in troops by helicopter and by sea. The gangs were outgunned, but they kept on fighting. By the end of that summer, 20 people were dead and 500 had been arrested. 50 guns were seized, along with 800 rounds of ammunition and enough Molotov cocktail to burn down West Kingston. By fall, Kingston's violence had taken on a frightening and permanent new pattern. Now the gangs were attacking dances, movie theaters, and rum shops downtown, and some of the gunmen were going uptown to rob the homes of the rich. The ruling JP declared a state of emergency that stayed in effect until the 1967 general election, in which it won a majority of parliamentary seats. By then, the gunmen who worked for the politician had become the new lords of the street, politely hailed as community leaders who could wage war and make peace. Some started calling themselves the Untouchables. in homage to Elliot Ness because they were beyond the law's reach. Dixie Dawkins, a Tel Aviv leader from Central, was one of Brambles' friends. He was graying and pretty much retired from active duties by the time I got to know him. But he still had a soldier's glint in his eyes despite the soft, Buddha-like punch above the waistband of his track shorts. The three of us often met at a rum shop on the Tel Aviv corner across the street from a mural of Michael Manley and Marcus Garvey decorated with graffiti that said Seaga raped Jamaica. We want no war. Seaga was a man who in them time used to come with the radicals on the streets and kick up pure rumpus, Dixie said. We called him blinds on account of the dark glasses he always wore. And when Blinds walked, it seemed like he had all the power in the world. You know that since he won the West Kingston seat for the first time in 1962, he has never held a rally in his constituency. He don't need to. That's how sure he is of his people there. Dixie acknowledged that Dudley Thompson had put his own force, the Spanglers, in the field because Seaga's method had left the PNP with no other choice. Meanwhile, an even more vicious kind of symbiosis was developing between the politicians and their paladins. As members of parliament from both parties consolidate power by building housing projects for their supporters, a mafia-style link was quickly formed between the construction industry and the gangs. The PNP built a housing project in West Kingston called Arnett Garden, soon popularly rechristened as Concrete Jungle. And it was during the building of this project that two gunmen, Fedamap and Bory Boy, emerged as PNP premier enforcers. By the early 1970s, when Michael Manley became prime minister, the ties between contractors and gunmen, between politicians and their outlaw bagmen, were too strong to break. The leaders had let slip the dogs of wars, and there would be no leashing them now. When Jamaicans look back to the beginnings of this tribal warfare in the Kingston of the 60s, they still argue over who started the fighting. Dudley Thompson and Edward Seaga are universally acknowledged to have been the field marshals, but for many people, the first skirmish was a speech Seaga made in 1965. The occasion was a ceremony at Kingston National Heroes Circle, where all the party leaders had gathered to commemorate two men who had led the bitter Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley were there, both aging and ailing, and Seaga and Michael Manley were there, only a few years away from becoming the leaders of their respective parties. Some youths in the crowd booed Seaga, and he faced them down with an open threat of war. If they think they are bad, he shouted, I can bring the crowds of West Kingston. We can deal with you in one way at any time. It will be fire for fire and blood for blood. No one doubted that he meant it. But of all the men at National Heroes Circle that day, perhaps Norman Manley grieved the most. He was then 4 years away from dying, exhausted by 3 decades of political struggle and battle with the force of the JP, and he lamented Seaga's rising power in this new era of violence and Jamaica, which threatened the whole basis of our national life. Norman Manley had made a speech during the 1966-67 state of emergency prompted by the West Kingston riots, in which he refrained from calling Seaga by name and instead spoke ominously of him only as this voice alien to Jamaica. With what voice does he speak? This highly educated and sophisticated man? What language does he use? Do we recognize the voice of Jamaica, or do we hear a voice alien to our ideals, our practices, and our faith? Our side cannot quiet this ugly turmoil. Both sides must meet and honestly agree. I hate to see Jamaica divided and torn. I hate to see Jamaicans killing and maiming Jamaicans while leaders roll around in comfort. I hate to see the spirit of nationhood broken and destroyed. Who will join me for Jamaica's sake? But no one was listening. It was already too late. You know, see it. You know, see it. Yeah, and I give thanks to the audience, you know, see it. And I hope you enjoy the reading. Share, like, and subscribe. And continue to, you know what I say, grow the channel. More bless, mad love and respect for our subscriber. Everybody else. See? Respect.